Another episode of The Lowdown. Another special guest today, good friend of mine and colleague. You work with me. Pako, tell us about yourself.
Hey, Lou, thanks for bringing me on board. Pako Tshiamala. I am a strategic marketer. So I run a consulting firm called Pedala Consulting Group. And I essentially come up with strategies to increase sales through marketing plans. And I work with CEOs to execute those strategies. And that's what we're doing at PinPoint Health. Essentially, we do physician engagement there. It's kind of hard to talk about sales in the healthcare environment, but we use technology solutions to engage physicians to essentially have them have better relationships with PinPoint clinics, right? So
and so just a bit of background to that. Like, I mean, we've known each other for a few years. I had Justin, who was on my podcast last week, who was my a very good friend and my next door neighbor when I was growing up in Malton. You also lived in Malton, went to Ascension. My brother was also one of your teachers growing up. And then I knew who you were when we were in high school, but we never really connected all that much. And then Justin, probably I'd say, 5, 6, 7 years ago, started us connecting. And for a while we were speaking about sort of working together with your company and my company, coming together to do some of the things that we've done. And then we started that about 1.5 years ago, where we actually started working together. And, and that's great. And that's amazing that we do that, but that's not the point of today's conversation. Obviously the point of today's conversation is to really dive in deeper into the idea of racism towards the Black community. And I wanted to have you on for a number of reasons, which but I'll explain so that the audience and sort of knows. But number one, you're incredibly intelligent, which I've always appreciated about you. You have an amazing thought process. And that I've known that from outside of this discussion, right? Like that was one of the reasons why I wanted to work with you, because you're also a go-getter. Like you work hard all the time. You do a lot of different things. And you never stop, and you try your hardest to really put the onus on yourself as an individual, which I really appreciate. I think that's probably one of the most important fundamental things that anybody can do, is really just put the onus on yourself as an individual. And then also an interesting thing is, and this is interesting because with everything going on right now, I have to be honest, like prior to George Floyd, and the whole idea of systemic racism and all these things, I don't want to say that I had no idea, but maybe I was more ignorant than I am now. I've done a lot of research since all of this stuff has been going on. And I've done research on both sides of it, right? So it's been interesting because I've been, and this is usually what I do, is I dive in deep to a lot of stuff. And so the Black Lives Matter movement, and I've looked deep into that. And then I've equally looked in and predominantly out of the US, because I mean, that's where all this stuff is happening. But there's a lot of people, they're actually Black individuals, people like Larry Edler, David Webb, Candace Owens, Officer Brandon Tatum. Like, these are all Black individuals who actually are sort of a minority in the sense that they're conservatives by nature in terms of the way that they vote. And I thought that was interesting. And I wasn't really aware of that big divide between, and I think something, and I heard the stats that they've been putting out, that 95% of the Black population in the US, for example, votes Democrat. And I mean, and there was a video that surfaced a few weeks ago about Joe Biden, for example. I forget who he was talking to, but he had a comment where he was talking to a Black individual, and the Black individual said, when you come to New York, I have some questions for you, blah, blah, blah. And Joe Biden responded by saying, if you have questions and you don't vote for me, like, you're not Black. And I thought, yeah, it was pretty crazy, because I actually think that is a systemic racism. Like, if the belief is that you have to vote a certain way, if you are a certain color, that is pretty much exactly what racism is, right? And so it's been interesting. And these people that I mentioned, like Larry Edler, Candace Owens, Brandon Tatum, they're definitely right-wing, more conservative folk. And they also, to some extent, have some controversial views even around everything about systemic racism and all these things. So I'm not necessarily saying I agree with one or the other, but it's been really interesting for me to look at both the sides of this argument and really try to come up with my own mind on what I think is going on and put things together. And the reason why I really wanted to speak to you, I mean, I would identify myself as more of a conservative. I would definitely say that I'm fiscally conservative from a sociological perspective, and I'm probably more progressive and liberal, right? Like things like gay marriage and stuff. Like I don't really care who you marry and any of these things. Like these things, everyone to me should have equal rights. So I'm very progressive and liberal on that side. But when it comes to finances and, you know, the welfare state and things like that, I'm a very conservative person. And so I don't necessarily, and this is another interesting thing, because I don't vote just one way because I identify with just one party. I really vote for whatever I think is best based on these things. And I think you're sort of that way, but you're a more conservative individual too, which I came to find out in the last, you know, few weeks is very, very rare to find that in the Black community. And I thought that was interesting, and I just sort of wanted to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, I think you hit at a very, very important points there, right? I think for a lot of Black people, it's very difficult for them to identify themselves in this binary in a political system we have. You know, whether you're conservative or, you know, like a liberal. And I say for me, I am, you know, essentially, I have a lot of liberal values. I have a lot of conservative values. I think when it comes to race, you know, the best practice is to lead with kindness. That's right. And what you might see a lot of, you know, like Blacks leading towards, you know, liberal parties is because they just tend to be more kind. And I think that is a shortfall of most conservative parties, whether you talk about Republicans in the US or the Conservative Party of Canada. I think that much is true. People
So can I challenge you on that a little bit?
Yeah, of course.
And it's just because to me it's interesting, this idea, like, you know, it's funny when you look at the extremes of the political spectrum and you think of extreme left and extreme right. And this idea that conservatives are more angry and rude and not kind and all these things. I mean, I don't really see the evidence of that, right? I actually tend to see that more on the left. And if you go, like, just do simple Google searches, like, you know, and you look at certain individuals and the way they act when they're more left-leaning and right-leaning, and it's an interesting thing that there's this ideology that it's one way or the other. And I think a really good example of that on a bigger scale is, like, let's take the prime minister of our country and the president of the US, right? Now, everybody just, you know, if you knew nothing and all you know is that one is Donald Trump and that the other is Justin Trudeau, I think most people would say, well, you know, Donald Trump must be the unkind racist, right? And Trudeau is this, you know, loving person who's kind to everybody. But again, when you sort of look at the facts, like, we had a big problem in this country, and I can't even believe that Trudeau's still in office, from the sense that he wore blackface, right? Like, that's extremely offensive. I felt like it didn't get the attention that it deserved. And he did this. And to me, it's just crazy that we, you know, I don't know enough about Trump, whether to say he's one way or another, and that's fine. But I'm just going back to your point where we think of left leaning versus right leaning. And so someone like Trudeau, like, I mean, I really think he's sort of the poster boy for privilege, right? Like, everything about him is privilege, so much so that he thinks he can wear blackface and it's not a big deal. And to me, it was just crazy.
Like I said, I think for a lot of Black people, you always have to accept the best of both worlds, right? And it's like, for us, and I'm not the representation, I don't speak for all Black people. I've assisted in liberal, you know, like political, like, before even getting to the political scene, I didn't even know that you had to pick a side. You know, in business, you can work for Microsoft today, and you can go work for Google, and you go for Facebook, and, you know, working on different sides is actually encouraged, and people poach you because of expertise you learn, etc. I learned very quickly you couldn't do that. You know, right? So as a young, eager person who wanted to get involved, you know, and make a contribution to society by learning more about politics and supporting, you know, like local candidates or provincial and federal ones, I was told, hey, you can't do that. You know, you can't help this person, you can't help that person. And so So we're kind of like, I think for Black people, like on top of all political priorities there are, our reality is that we have to vote Black, right? And there isn't like a pro-Black party.
Right.
And so a lot of times we attach ourselves to people who put themselves out there. And when you talk about evidence, and before talking about Trudeau and his privilege, when you talk about evidence, I think the best evidence is the one you've lived in my own experience. And so I think that like if I talk, when you talk about kindness, like my experience is, hey, I've worked on parties where, and I'm not saying like it's you know, I worked on the race for conservative leadership, and one of the big topics there was essentially immigration, and basically the rhetoric on the conservative side was obviously like, you know, Canadians first, and essentially like the rhetoric wasn't really like I think the rhetoric wasn't like, oh, you know, like it was like, let's end extreme, you know, or mass immigration or whatever, you know what I mean? Whereas on the other side, you know, liberals were talking about like, you know, like increasing from Syria. The conservatives were talking about like, let's end mass immigration, and we're talking about, you know, like it would be terrorism, just a rhetoric, terrorism malpractice, to not expect, you know, like terrorists to use this immigration program to come into our country. And then you have people who, you know, vote with their conscience, who like might be Jew, for example, and they think about their experience as Jews, you know, of the Second World War or whatever, and they're like, hey, you know, like if I was fleeing from Germany and I had nowhere else to go, like, is this how I would want to be treated? Like, I mean, these conversations I'm having in political circles, in conservative circles, in conservative, you know, political clubs, and there are debates between conservatives. And, you know, the only people who actually like would come, or, you know, would essentially speak with sense would be, you know, like these Polish Jews or whatever who've been here for centuries, are like, hey, my great-grandparents came here through world wars. Why aren't we letting these Syrians in? So that's like one example of where I've seen like, you know, people lead with kindness, you know, in terms of the immigration policy. I think another example was, I worked on Maxime Bernier, who's a great guy. I met Maxime at a Christmas party, and somebody realized that we were both French speakers, so he introduced me to Maxime Bernier. And I think I emailed him, and within 30 seconds, he was like, you know, he replied back. You know, he's like a real estate guy, got a business person, lawyer, and member of parliament in the area of Quebec there. But he was just very responsive. You know, you can just tell some people have great energy. Yeah. And you're like, hey, if this guy has this much great energy, like just, you know, on a personal and business side, imagine what he can do on the political side, right? And the conservative race, the race for the leadership was, you know, this guy, so it was, what was his name again? The Andrew Scheer. Yeah, Andrew, so it was Scheer versus Maxime Bernier. Andrew Scheer was a career politician who's never really had a job outside of, you know, writing insurance policies. And then, you know, had Bernier, who was like a former lawyer and former, you know, like business executive, and vice president, and, you know, like member of parliament for so many, it was just different, right? So I went with Bernier, support. But again, I looked at all his policies and I was for them all. But one of the things I didn't like, it was like, he didn't really acknowledge that there are different kinds of Canadians, right? Very much against the fact that, hey, Native Indians are not the same, you know. He wasn't even like, I think he was trying to take away some transfer payments, you know, from, you know, certain provinces, etc. And he didn't really like see the individualization of certain groups. And he thought that recognizing certain groups for who they are, whether you're, you know, from Atlantic Canada or from Quebec, or whether you're Native Indian or whatever, took away from your identity as a Canadian. Whereas I think it enriched it. And I've seen, other groups do it better than we did. Liberals do it better than conservatives is. So I have to agree of the shortfall I see on the on the conservative side, right? Like when you try to paint everybody with the same picture, you're like, hey, it's all about being Canadian. Forget your individuality. That's a problem, right? And I'm not surprised, the election was lost to Trudeau. Like when it was lost because there was nothing, that conservatives were leading by that was relatable on a human level, from my opinion, right? I think
well, and the reality is that they lost.
Sorry?
The reality is that they lost because of the Toronto area and the Montreal area, right? When you looked at where the way it was all spread, it's a pretty it's a funny system when you consider that, right? That essentially these two large cities can essentially mandate who controls the whole country. So I mean, to some extent, we can't say that, and they did only get a minority government as well, right? So that's the other reality that maybe there's a shift in focus there.
Well, one of the things that they were really strong in, and I'm not a political commentator, but I know one of the things that they struggled with was inner city support.
Yeah.
You look at places like Toronto, Montreal, they are, overwhelmed by minorities, a lot of minorities who have a lot of political motivations to vote that, conservatives just didn't speak to. And, it's being anti-refugee, when it's just the most human thing ever. I think the Liberals had something going for them. Not only were they passive aggressively, kinder on the refugee stance where the Syrian crisis, and there were a lot of also immigrants from Haiti, and they were crossing the border and whatever. And then, we weren't denying them we weren't denying them at the border, but the conservatives were denying them at the border. They come with their own problems. It was just kind of witch hunt kind of mentality. But the Trudeaus were like, hey, let's liberalize, marijuana, right? They were leading with that, and it was a competitive advantage. And it was also an additional act of kindness because Trudeau had that story with his brother committing suicide. You know what I mean? So the rhetoric was just the rhetoric is a little different, and I think that as much as people are rational, and Trudeau had a blackface. Now coming back to Trudeau, I think people vote on for a lot of minorities, they have a lot of immigration ties, and as much as I'm a conservative, I don't really agree with the conservative immigration policy. It makes sense. It's just not practical. They do nothing to attract minorities and to make minorities feel that it's a party for you. And that's a shortfall that they had back then, and I think it's a shortfall that they have.
Now, isn't there, again, and I think so, in watching some of the things that I've been watching, and my stance is I don't necessarily agree or disagree, right? I'm just sort of want to have the conversation. And I want to sort of be the devil's advocate just so we can continue the conversation. But some of the, using the example of the states, right, and some of the individuals that I mentioned that are Black conservatives, and they speak about this idea of sanctuary cities and illegal immigrants. Now, we're not talking about in Canada about illegal immigrants, right? But just this example of big immigration and these types of states. One of the things that they actually show, and it's quite compelling, is that as you get more of these people, they're going to take on a lot of the more unskilled work at cheaper prices. And what that actually does is it pushes certain communities, predominantly Black communities and individuals in the Black community, out of those potential jobs that they would otherwise have. And so that sort of leads to the continual oppression, in a sense. And that's one of the conservative arguments to that, is really that what we're trying to do is, and I get it, I'm just sort of, again, challenging what you're saying. I'm with you, right? My belief is, I think I agree with you. My parents are both immigrants to this country, right? So, here I am today being someone contributing to society. So I think immigration is important, but I think that's also an interesting argument that sort of could lead to some type of systemic oppression that continues to happen, because these people, the immigrants, and especially in the case of illegal immigrants, which I don't think anybody agrees with, they do take on a large amount of the work, unskilled work, at cheaper prices, and that sort of pushes other people out of that marketplace.
No, I think smart immigration policies and protection of borders, is not something that, like we should pretend are not needed. Definitely needed. I think if you want to talk about, creating opportunities for Black people, there are a lot more pressing priorities outside of, immigration or sanctuary cities that can help, lift Black people out of poverty. And I think that to focus the conversation on that is just a pretext. You know what I mean? And those people are making a good argument for, they're making a good argument, but it's not a big enough argument. It's like very negligible in terms of other priorities when it comes to like dismantling like institutional racism and societal racism in a way that puts Black people at a disadvantage, right? So those are good points, but there's bigger things that can be done to help Black people outside of denying people who are coming from these South American countries entry to the U.S. And I don't really like focusing too much on U.S. politics because I'm not American, and
and neither my wife is, but I'm not. But
yeah, just as a background, like I'm from the Congo. I was born in the Congo. I came here in 2001 or something. So, but I have a lot of friends who are Canadian and American born, and sometimes when we talk about global politics, and when you hear the ignorance when you hear the ignorance in their the things that they say, I'm just like, wow, I hope, I don't ever want to be in this position where I talk about things I don't understand, especially I think what I see on TV about America is obviously pretty obvious. They have a serious challenges, but I can't really speak to that. What I can speak to is, in terms of I think there's conservative values that are better for Black people than some liberal values, right?
Like, can you give us an example?
Sorry?
Give us an example.
Yeah, I think,
which, knowing you're getting there, you're just setting it up for me.
Yeah, I think there's conservative values such as, meritocracy, right?
Yeah.
The limitation to that is obviously as a Black person, I can try as hard as I want to, but at which point I reach that ceiling where it's no longer my individual, effort, and it's more of a societal thing. You know what I mean? So I think that
and can I stop you there and just on that point? Do you think that exists in a widespread, just as an example, I run a pretty decently sized company, right? And if you looked at everybody at my company, there's all different cultures. I never prevent someone from doing more, moving up or whatever, based on the idea that, whether they're Black or white or Asian or male or female or whatever. So, and I'm just speaking for myself, right? So I'm just sort of thinking, and I mean, you've interacted with me a lot, but how, you actually think that this is happening? And I'm asking for your opinion because I'm ignorant towards it, right? So I'm asking you to
absolutely. So I'm an entrepreneur, right? So we take risks and expect those risks to pay off in a very, very big way. And ultimately, the way in which you run a business is you have to, essentially have no excuses, right? So any reason you essentially promote as a reason for, as a reason for your lack of failure is essentially an excuse, right? And I think that mentality is good for, individual success. But I think if we're looking at things from an institutional, macroeconomic level, it doesn't really benefit anyone, right? So the problem with conservatives sometimes is that they take this mentality that is, this business mentality and they bring it to government. It's like, that's not how you run a government. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Government is here for the people. So I believe in like so conservative values, such as what's it called? Like basically low taxes, for example, right? Like,
Right.
I don't want to be taxed, you know, at a certain amount of money. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I think if you were actually to give a lot of Black people some tax cuts, if they were to invest in, you know, start their own businesses, whatever, it's a lot better than giving, you know, quote unquote, like, you know, like welfare. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Yeah.
So if you were to
Something
you know,
that
have a
incentivizes.
conservative policy, like, hey, you know, like let's, you know, we'll make you tax free so long as you're starting up an entire business, because tax breaks do happen for the ultra rich, and you know, for whether we like it or not, most of the ultra rich people are white people, right? And they're incentivized to start businesses, to grow their businesses, and quadruplify their businesses, so long as they know where the tax loops are, right? I think, you know, like having tax programs geared specifically towards, you know, people of color, if they want to start their own businesses to stimulate, you know, Black business activity, is great. I think the entrepreneurial mindset that is promoted within conservative circles, in terms of like, you know, having a meritocracy-based kind of like system when it comes to, you know, like your way of life, and how you make money, and not depending on the government. I think that's huge on a mentality point of view. I think it just can come across as out of touch when you're speaking to people who, you know, are not in business. Like, I'm in business, you're in business, both entrepreneurs, but you know, the majority of people who exist in society are not, you know, luckily for us, right? They just want security. They just want, you know, to live a comfortable life.
But there's also nothing that's sort of preventing them. Like, I mean, you and I are both great examples, and we've talked about this outside of this. Like, I mean, I started from the very, very scratch. There were no handouts, there were no nothing. I just sort of started doing things, and sort of, and I think this will go on to where I want to take this conversation, which is the power of the individual, right? Your individualness, and in terms of doing what you need to do. And there's a lot of things around that. But I mean, I don't know. I think to some extent, there's nothing preventing people from trying. I mean, it's not easy for sure. I think it maybe takes a certain type of individual. And even this idea that people that make a lot of money or corporations get these tax breaks and stuff, like, I mean, I have numerous corporations, all these things. I pay a lot of taxes. Like, this is not, you know, maybe at a certain level, if you're the top 1% or something, maybe there's some things there. But the average person who's in business, and small to medium-sized businesses are really the backbone of the economy, right? And where most people are working. I have not seen these massive tax breaks, like, you know, that people say exist. You're still paying a lot in taxes, in different taxes that you wouldn't at the individual level. And like you, I agree that people should be taxed less in general, because then they can keep more of their income, they can do better things with it, whatever they may want to do. And so, you know, I do think paying taxes is obviously important, because we do need to, you know, fund the public. And there are certain welfare programs of sort that are important, right? It's not like they're all a way of disincentivizing people to do things. So some are important.
Yeah, I think yeah, I reflected a lot about this. Like, I've always, when you talk about individualism and, you know, what we can do, and, you know, what's preventing us from you know, from what's preventing everybody to just do what you do or what I do, whatever. I think normally you'd like to, I think it's good to have a mentality that nothing, you know, can prevent you, and to go ahead and do that. I think for a lot of people, they have tried, and then they just become discouraged, right? It's just like when you look at, you know, like unemployment rates, at a certain point, as an economist, if people are actively looking for jobs, then we count them as unemployed. But if they're discouraged and they're not looking for jobs anymore, they're not. You can't even count them as, you know, taken into consideration as unemployed. They're just discouraged people. They're not part of the unemployment rate. And I think that's where you'll find a lot of Black people, when I look at my friends' parents, some of them would have stories where, hey, I had X amount of interviews, and this has been my result, so I don't even bother anymore. And for a lot of, like people who come from prior generations, that's essentially been the reality. And unfortunately, those mentalities get passed down, right?
Yeah.
From generation to generation. And those experiences are lived. Like I've dated a girl who, her parents are bilingual, but she'll never go to Montreal, or, you know what I mean? Because her dad immigrated to Montreal, and he had all these degrees. He's a pharmacist, by the way. He had all these degrees, whatever. He wanted to work in pharmaceuticals. And I think, Ethiopians have like these Christian names, like, I think, yeah, Ethiopia has a huge history with Christianity, and they have these Christian first names and last names. So he would get these jobs, and he would see in the facial expressions, the disappointment when people would realize he was kind of Black. And so he just left Montreal and came to Toronto. And her entire, like, whenever I talk about Montreal or whatever, she just brings up the story that her dad had, and essentially she would never go there and work there. So long story short, I think for a lot of people, they've tried, and unfortunately have kind of hit that ceiling where they have come across, like racism or discrimination in the workplace, or in the investment space as well. And they've stopped, right? I think that's where there's individualism, and then there's also just like institutions that were built that are bigger than you. And I think where you and I were talking about the concept of essentially white privilege and what that essentially means, I think that's where I think that's where the dividing line essentially is. And yeah, I don't know what your feedback is, you know what I mean? But
I don't know, right? Because I mean, I'm not a Black individual, so it's hard for me to say what that experience may be. So I obviously would rather hear what your take is on that. And I think that's important. I think there is something to be said that, you talked about when people sort of feel like they've hit a ceiling. I mean, if I had stopped every time I felt I hit a ceiling, I'd never be anywhere. And I think there's something to be said about perseverance. And again, I think it goes back, like, see, here's a big problem that I think that has happened in society is we always focus on the biggest levels of government. The reason, like, when you look at the world, right, and there's different countries, the reason is because, what's happening with me here today sitting in Toronto may not be the same as what's happening to someone sitting in Moscow, Russia, right? So you segregate based on country. And then, even within countries, then there's provinces, and then within the provinces, there's regions, and then there's cities, and even within those cities, there's smaller councils. So we really have come to understand that government and the control goes down because you have to really govern to those closest to you so that you can sort of know the reality of it. I think the one first thing of government, the idea of, and I use the term government in quotation marks, that's been lost, is this idea of family, right? Where your family is where it starts, right? The people that you're with and governing that a certain way. And even below that, the most fundamental level is you govern yourself, right? Like you as an individual govern your thoughts, your actions, all of those things. And so I think this reliance on, like, even the idea, like what Canada, what the federal government of Canada does day to day is not going to be as powerful as what my municipal government does day to day, because I'm in that. But it's also not going to be as powerful as my family, what we do every day. And it's not going to be as powerful as the thoughts that are with me every single moment of every single day. And I just think there's something to be said about those two levels that are often never talked about, which is individual and the family. And when you can structure things in a certain way, and again, even outside of the family, because there's unfortunate circumstances, but the one thing that we all have is an individual. We are all individuals, and we can all govern our thoughts, our actions. And I guess my message is just simply, I think everyone should always keep trying no matter what. And if you're always going to look for an excuse, this is my worry about it. If the idea is that you look for an excuse to stop because there's something there preventing you, then you will inherently probably stop because you feel like it's designed to be against you. And I know even in the business things that I've done, I have no business training. I mean, I'm a healthcare professional. I had no business training. I'm doing my MBA now because of how ignorant I was. But I would do a lot of things that people would say, you're actually going to do that? Like, you're going to try that? And I'd be like, yeah, well, why not? What's the worst that can happen? Like, you know, you know, the worst that's going to happen is it doesn't go anywhere, but at the very least I can try. And so I think that's an important thing. If you're always looking, and you and I were talking about the example, if you and I are, say, working on a project, right, which we do all the time, if you and I disagree, right, you know that we disagree because my thoughts are different than your thoughts, period. You don't sit there and say, well, Luigi's disagreeing with me because I'm black, right? Like, he's racist towards me. And so that's my thing. Sometimes, like, you may just never know, right? And I think to always default to I'm being disagreed with or this or that because of the color of my skin may potentially prevent people from moving forward, because then they and again, I don't know, because again, I'm not a black person, so I'm sort of trying to work through this, as I've said, and I've been watching and learning a lot of different things. And I definitely think there's a problem, 100%. But the one thing that I think we can all control, and where I would hope that people have some type of awakening or enlightenment, is that we all exist at the individual level. So if we all do the things that individually we keep persevering. And yes, of course, we have to work on all the other problems, the systemic problems that exist and everything. I mean, listen, I'm not going to sit here and say that I've never felt like I've had I'm of Italian descent, okay? I've had a lot of racist things said towards me in my life as an Italian from other nationalities, predominantly white people. You know, my name is Luigi. You couldn't pick a more ethnic type of name. I feel like that sometimes has prevented me from certain things, which is, in all honesty, when I first started doing all of the stuff that I was doing, especially on radio, in consulting with some people, the idea was go more with Lou, which is really what my family calls me anyways, just because it's a short form. But the idea was it was less ethnic, right? So that's why this is the Lou down and all these things. So I think this idea of racism, like, not the idea, but the reality of racism exists. And I think black individuals disproportionately feel that even more than anybody else. Because I mean, if I felt it as an Italian, surely you have felt it 1,000 times worse as a black man, right? Like, I think that's just the reality of it.
Yeah, definitely. No, I totally agree. I think that there's obviously blacks have a responsibility to themselves to essentially be go-getters, you know, and, you know, be the best that they can be. And I think that when it comes to personal achievement, your responsibility should always be to yourself. I think when we look at, you know, racism from an institutional point of view, and from what I understand of it is, you know, essentially the societal kind of like privileges that one group is afforded over another racialized minority. I think that there's something that can be done also by non-blacks to, you know, like essentially stop, you know, the perpetuation of racism, which is like a default kind of reality that we're essentially born in. And so I think that's that. I think conversations like this are just so beneficial to, you know, like people of both groups. I think that as a black person, what I would say is I don't essentially wait for, you know, people to, you know, like forward opportunities for me, or to essentially like, you know, giving me like a hand up, or, you know what I mean? I think that I can, yeah, I think my message to, I have to be very careful how I say this because I don't want to get too much backlash here. Yeah, my message to, if I was speaking.
So before you go on, isn't that an interesting thing though? Because, you know, I think even me, I sort of sometimes tippy toe, and I said when I was talking with Justin, I wanted to have an open conversation because I think that's really the only way we move forward. Isn't it sad that we live in a world nowadays where you clearly had a thought, right? And you had to stop and say, I need to tippy toe because of the backlash. Like, why can't we have the conversation? I think you and I are both individuals that are ready to have our minds opened up in different ways and change our opinions. And I've done that my whole life with a bunch of different things. I think it's a sad thing that, we can't have these conversations. And the minute someone starts talking about something, I love Dave Chappelle. Okay. I love him. And did you see his YouTube special that he released?
No, I didn't.
Okay. So anyways, I mentioned Candace Owens earlier on as a Black conservative that talks about stuff. He lambasted her in his special, okay? Like, just absolutely destroyed her, which I thought was sad, because again, I think as two people like Dave Chappelle and Candace Owens in the Black community, I think really what they should be doing is having a conversation, right?
Yeah.
And for him to go out and like completely trash her and the things that he said about her, it's crazy. I think that's wrong. I think we need to be able to have conversations that at some points might feel a little uncomfortable for everybody, in order to really progress. I think that's the only way progression happens. I mean, you and I from the business world know that that's the reality of progression, because that's how you progress a business. You sit down, you really hammer things out, and you go into uncomfortable things. Some people disagree with it, others don't. You find common ground and you move forward. But I don't know. I just think that that's a very, very sad thing. And I think the other thing that sort of makes me sick around this, and I'll let you finish your thought and actually want your opinion on this, is a lot of the virtue signaling out there, right? Like, where you see people like apologizing and doing things, and they're really just doing it for their own attention. They're not really helping anything. And I think it's all bullshit, right? Like, at the end of the day, and there's been videos that have, especially from celebrities, like, the last thing that I think we need is any type of advice from these celebrities that live in their, $20 million mansions, who are totally out of touch with reality. And they're trying to tell us all these things. And it's constant, whether it's around global warming or this or that. They're going to go to the Academy Awards and talk about, global warming, but they all showed up there in limos, right? So it's just so hypocritical, and it's BS. And I love when people call them out. But a lot of the virtue signaling that's out there, I think what's really more productive is conversations. Like, let's learn. Like, you teach me. I know in speaking with you and Justin and other people, other Black friends of mine over the last 2 months, I've changed some of my things that I never understood before, ideologies. I've been able to change. And I'm not racist to begin with, right? So I'm just saying it helps.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that conversations do help. I just think that, conversations that are obviously like, well informed, right? Like, you should think twice before you say something.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
It's obviously, the radical candor is a good thing. So, like, we're living in a world where radical candor is like these things. Donald Trump made it so. Obviously guys like Dave Chappelle are going to say what they have to say. But my think was like, obviously, like, as a Black person, the reason I've been able to essentially go places where a lot of my Black counterparts haven't been able to is because I've ignored the fact that I was Black until I was essentially have to create this world where that, like, obviously you can't escape the fact that you're Black, but you have to essentially be colorblind. I don't know how healthy that is, but I think as a Black person, it's very important to essentially look for success in, like, without like thinking about the roadblocks of racism at the forefront. And the reality is, are you going to have to try 10 times harder than, a white person to, get that job, get that executive position, or, get investment dollars from investors? Probably yes. And the reason behind that societal or a fruit of institutional racism? Obviously, yes. I think we've come to a level of consciousness where we're recognizing that. What I would say is, like, we still have enough resources and there's enough channels for us to make our success a result of individual efforts.
Right.
And it's just as simple as that. I think there's no excuse from a sort of like, resource-based level to, not be successful as a result of, quote unquote, racism today. That's been like my lived experience, because we live in the world of like, scarce resource, and I think the biggest scarce resource now is individual contributors, right?
100%. That's what I'm saying to you. I agree
Right?
with you, right? Like I see it
Yeah.
with my counterparts, with other people. It's crazy. I just think it really does. I love everything you're saying. I mean, you and I agree on almost 100% of things. That's why we get along. But I think you're right. I think it does come down to, like, yeah, the reality is that these things exist for sure, 100%. We all agree about that. So now the next reality is, well, are you going to let it keep you down and never try to do anything? Or are you going to do what you've done, what I've done, and is just simply work hard and, put all that stuff behind you and sort of try to move forward? Not put it behind you. I guess that's the wrong way to put it, because it's a reality, right? So it has to be there, and it needs to be worked on. I don't want people using it as an excuse. And listen, in life, there's a million excuses, not just, even if we're not talking about the Black conversation, right? And we're just going to talk about people being successful. There are a billion reasons for you to stop at a billion different points, right? There's every single reason that you shouldn't do something, whatever it may be. If you're always looking at that, you're never going to go anywhere. And that's what I try to tell people anyways, when it comes in general to wanting to achieve what you want to achieve. You can focus on the roadblocks, and when you get to them, and stop and turn around and go back and just stay where you were, or you find a way around that roadblock. That is the reality of it. That is the reality of life. And I think that's a common thing, even with what I do in healthcare, right? Where I'm dealing with a lot of chronic pain people. This is a conversation that I have with them. Like, one of the things that I often hear is, oh, I can't because I'm in pain. It's like, that's your roadblock, right? You can choose to stop there and stay there and let that be your excuse, or you can go around it. And I mean, just take that ideology and put it to anything in terms of like wanting to lose weight, right? Like, oh, I don't have the time. Fine, there's your roadblock. Like, you don't have the time, so you can choose to stay there, or you can go around it. And I think that is the reality of life, that individuals need to always find their ways around roadblocks.
Yeah, I think those roadblocks are there. I think as much as it's a roadblock, obviously as a Black person, the ultimate responsibility rests upon me to remove every roadblock along the way for me to achieve my success. I think in a conversation about racism and understanding what racism is, there's also a responsibility for white people specifically to essentially address, like the roadblocks, that essentially have been created by them, right?
Okay. So can I ask you something around that?
Essentially their actions or inactions.
Gotcha. So again, going back to the individual, and I want to do something. So again, I don't think anybody would. I mean, I'm not a racist, right? And as I mentioned to you, you're one of my like lead people. You're a Black individual. You've met the other lead people in my organization. It's not some homogeneous group. So if I don't think that I'm doing anything wrong, right? Just that's my perception. Your suggestion is I could still do better. And my question to you is, what types of things can individuals like me, who feel like they're not really doing anything wrong, they're not contributing to this problem, what are some of, and I'm asking you, I'm saying, like, what are some of the things that you would like to see out of me, out of someone that I don't think that I'm doing anything wrong? I think I'm trying to help by doing things like this, by having these conversations. What more can I do?
I think that essentially like recognizing, that racism is not necessarily like what you essentially are doing or the predispositions you have. I think a lot of times racism, based on the reading that I've done, and I'm no expert, is more about like the institutions, right? And it's also about a lot of like, like biases that are unconscious, you know what I mean? And in terms of like what you can do, I think, learning more about the subject as you are doing now is a first, essentially big step. I think, going out of your way to, essentially increase representation, of Blacks, within your organization is huge. Affording opportunities that were denied to, people because of the neighborhoods they grew up in or societies they grew up in. Like creating mentorship programs, for example.
Hey, we do that. We both grew up in Malton. That was not a great area. One of my clinics that's closest to that area, we actually have a program with the high school kids where they come and work at the clinic, right? So, I mean, hey, I hear you loud and clear on that stuff, because I think we both grew up in a community where there's another right thing. When you look at like institutional problems, there's also institutional problems on the idea of socioeconomic status of areas, right? Which, and that's a huge problem. And so, 100%, I could definitely say that growing up, like, when we consider where we grew up, the things we had, and then if you went to another area of Mississauga, how different it was, that's clearly a system of oppression in some way.
Yeah, because I think we talked about, like, the biggest form of racism we can talk about is like segregation, right? And I think so biggest form of, if we talk about the biggest representation of racism we have, example is segregation. If you look at the way the areas and neighborhoods in which people live, like I've had friends who've had tech startups for very basic ideas, who've raised millions of dollars, have essentially, like, their businesses do not exist anymore, and the ease and facility for them to raise that money is by extension because of the societal privileges that they have in terms of who they know, the neighborhoods they grew in, and how easily trust is afforded based on social circles. You know what I mean? And it's not, whether you like it or not, like, money is, like, generational. And segregation just added, like, in 1964, right? So I think what can happen from an anti-racist point of view, on an individual level, is, in terms of what you want to do, is if you want to essentially, like, contribute to a Black fund, for example, right. So that more Black entrepreneurs, whether it's a $50,000 fund or a $100,000 fund, there's different levels of funds, can essentially get that experience into entrepreneurialism, because they don't have access to the same pools of money if you're talking about an institutional level. Because I don't think racism is, obviously there's individual racism, right? And that exists. But I think for the most part, in the conversation that we're bringing to light today, is how can I, as an individual, create opportunities of take anti-racist actions, right? So to reverse, what's the kind of the societal reality that we're essentially born in, right? Mm-hmm. Those are very simple, like, examples of what can be done. And again, it's going above and beyond what you're essentially already doing. And it's a proactive action that say, hey, well, I know these guys are going to try very, very, very hard, but here's what I can do to, make a difference. Right now, I see a lot of funds that are starting to support Black entrepreneurs, or mostly just being started by Black, Black millionaires or billionaires, or Black people of privilege. I think that would go a long way. And yeah, I think from a perspective of, I am not a racist, but I do acknowledge that racism exists, and it's a generational thing. What can I do to reverse that? It's a perfect program. One thing I would also say is also encouraging, like, if you're buying a commodity, right? And it's like, it doesn't matter where you can buy it from. If you want to go and buy it specifically from a Black, like, business, right, it would go a long way in terms of increasing investment into that community and having that investment multiply if that community essentially keeps that money within.
Gotcha. It's great stuff, buddy.
All right.
Thank you for doing this. What are you laughing at?
I love how into this conversation you are.
Well, I mean, I'm always interested in conversations. I mean, that's what sort of my life has been in terms of how I learn so many different things, is just to speak with people and to learn and to hear what the thoughts and are. And you and I do that all the time for other things that we work on together. I think this is the way this needs to be done. People, you need to, the one great thing about what's happened, the silver lining of, George Floyd being killed is horrible, but the silver lining of it is that it's been a tipping point, right? Where now people are having these conversations and people are progressing. And I mean, you've just told me things that I can do more than what I'm doing, right? Like, that's what I want to hear. Like, this is one of the problems with social justice movements that I have is like, you're going to go out there and you're going to protest, but what's the ask, right? What are we going to do? And I think that's an important thing. And those social justice movements of the past had that ask, right? Like, if women were going to protest, they were protesting for the right to vote. It was very clear what they wanted. Now, the problem is I feel like, well, what is, like, okay, so what are we doing? Like, I get it, the protest, perfect. I get that people are angry. I'm angry, everybody's angry, but now what do we do? And
Exactly.
This is where you have to have this stuff, these conversations with people, with individuals. And I think the overarching message of today is individuals, right? Because this is an example of like not relying on institutions. You and I as two individuals are relying on each other, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody has friends, has family. Go speak to them, figure it out. Like, you can make. And if you change at the individual level, then you will change at the family level, then you'll change at the city level, you'll change at the regional level, provincial, country, world, right? Like, it just goes back to that idea.
I'd love to have a conversation as to what we as individuals can do from, like a Black perspective and from a white perspective, because obviously the conversation that the discourse at large is white supremacy, right? And obviously, like, I feel like it's a very uncomfortable conversation for white people to have, but also for other racialized minorities. They're like, hey, why Blacks only? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Those are good topics that we could have like essentially got into that we didn't. But I'd love to have this conversation again, or even just expand.
Well, I was saying to Justin is I think the next nice segue would be doing the three of us, right? Yeah, and since he's done one with me, you've done one with me now. In terms of the podcast and this conversation, maybe that's the next conversation that we have, and we just continue build. One of the other problems with movements is they're popular for a month and then they die out, right? Exactly. And so with my podcast, I'm trying to do different things, but I just did the podcast with Justin, and some people might have said, well, what are you going to talk about the same thing again? It's like, well, yeah, because if you don't keep the conversation going, then we like that defeats the purpose. That's the whole problem here. If you don't keep it going, and that's my problem with virtue signaling, where someone just wants to put out like a square on a Tuesday, right? Like, which I think is an important thing because it gets out a message. But if that's the only thing that you've done is post a square on a Tuesday, you're not really helping the problem, right? To really help the problem, you need to continue these conversations. You need to continue the discourse so that everybody can start to learn and evolve.
Exactly. Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I'm here. I'm open. I'm available to have this conversation. So I'll wait to hear back from you for the conversation, three-way conversation with Justin, and see how we can essentially go from there.
Sounds good, buddy. Thank you so much for doing this today. I appreciate it. I appreciate all your insight, and I think people find this really valuable.
Thank you. I think that, a round of applause to you to have, this conversation. That's obviously tough, uncomfortable. And, I kind of, give you 5 thumbs up for, being as candid as you were, because, without tough conversations, there's not going to be change in progress. So I'm going to hop off, but, thank you very much for your time. And
thanks, buddy. Appreciate it again. See you, bud.